The dawn broke over the Texas hill country, with a silence so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. And when Jane Rivers stepped out of her cabin that morning, she found 200 Comanche warriors standing motionless in her yard, every single one of them with their heads bowed low. 3 days earlier, she had been a widow with nothing left but a dying ranch and one last mare. And the choice she made in the darkest hour of that terrible night would either be the end of her story or the beginning of something no white settler had ever experienced on this unforgiving frontier. The Texas sun beat down on Jane Rivers like a punishment from God himself, turning the parched earth beneath her boots into something that cracked and bled dust with every step. She stood at the edge of her property, looking out over land that had once been green, once been fertile, once been full of promise, when her husband Thomas had first staked their claim here 7 years ago. Now it was just another graveyard, though Thomas had the decency to be buried proper in the small plot behind the house, marked with a wooden cross she had carved herself when the fever took him last winter. The ranch was dying the same slow death as everything else in this drought-stricken corner of the frontier. The creek that used to run clear and cold through the eastern pasture had dried to nothing more than a dusty scar in the landscape. The cattle were long gone, sold off one by one, just to buy flour and coffee and the basic supplies that kept Jane alive from one brutal week to the next. The barn stood empty except for mice and memories, its boards warped and splitting in the relentless heat. But Jane still had one thing left, one last piece of the life she and Thomas had tried to build together. In the small paddock beside the cabin stood a mare, a beautiful chestnut quarter horse named Copper, with a coat that still gleamed like a new penny even in this hard country. Thomas had loved that horse, had trained her himself from a filly, and Jane had refused every offer to buy her over these long months of struggle. Copper was more than an animal, more than property. She was the last connection to the man Jane had loved, the last reminder that this place had once held hope instead of just dust and sorrow. Jane walked to the paddock now, her skirts gathering the fine powder that passed for soil in this dried-out season. Copper lifted her head and nickered softly, coming to the fence with that gentle trust that horses give to the people who care for them. Jane reached up and stroked the mare's nose, feeling the soft warmth of breath against her palm, and for just a moment she let herself remember what it felt like when Thomas would ride Copper across the property, checking the fences and the water and all the 100 small things that keep a ranch running. He had looked so alive on that horse, so full of purpose and strength. And Jane had believed back then that they could make it, that this hard land would eventually yield to their determination and their love. That belief seemed like a fool's dream now. Jane was 31 years old and felt twice that age, worn down by work and grief and the crushing loneliness of being the only white woman for 20 miles in any direction. Her nearest neighbors were the Hutchinson family, and they were a 3-hour ride to the south, close enough to trade with occasionally, but too far away to count on for help when trouble came. And trouble always came, eventually, to those who tried to carve out a life on the edge of Comanche territory. The Comanche had been here long before settlers like Jane and Thomas arrived with their land grants and their plows and their absolute certainty that they had a right to fence off the prairie and call it their own. The local tribes had been pushed back, treaty by treaty and battle by battle, but they had never truly left. They moved through this country like ghosts, visible only when they chose to be, and the stories that circulated among the settlers were enough to make any rational person pack up and head back east to civilization. Stories of raids and burnings, of livestock stolen in the night, of settlers who simply vanished and were never heard from again. Jane had heard all those stories, had felt the fear that came with them, but she had also seen another side of the Comanche presence in this land. She had seen them at a distance, watching from ridgelines, moving across the horizon in small groups that appeared and disappeared like heat mirages. She had found their tracks near her creek, back when it still held water, had once discovered a bundle of sage tied with leather cord hanging from a tree near her property line. And she had left it there undisturbed because she understood it for what it was, a marker, a message, a sign that she was being observed and measured by standards she could never fully comprehend. Thomas had been more dismissive of the Comanche, more confident in the superiority of settler civilization and the inevitability of American expansion across the continent. He had carried a rifle everywhere he went, and had talked sometimes about joining up with the ranging companies that patrolled the frontier looking for hostile Indians. Jane had always talked him out of it, had reminded him that they had a ranch to run and crops to tend and a life to build that did not require them to go looking for violence. Now Thomas was dead anyway, taken not by any warrior's arrow, but by a sickness that turned his skin yellow and made him shake with chills, even as the fever burned through him. And Jane had nursed him through those terrible final days with a helplessness that haunted her still. She turned away from Copper and walked back toward the cabin, a small structure built from rough-hewn logs that leaked dust through every crack and gap in the walls. The inside was spare and functional, a single room with a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs that Thomas had made, a bed that felt too large now that she slept in it alone, and shelves that held her few possessions, a Bible, some cooking pots, a photograph of her parents back in Missouri, and the Navy Colt revolver that Thomas had taught her to shoot before the fever took him. Jane could hit what she aimed at with that revolver, though she had never had cause to fire it at anything more threatening than a coyote sniffing around the chicken coop. The chickens were gone now, too, taken by predators, or simply dead from the heat and the lack of decent feed. Jane had eaten the last hen 2 weeks ago, and the silence around the property felt even more oppressive without the familiar sounds of clucking and scratching in the yard. She was living on hardtack and beans and the occasional rabbit she could trap, stretching her supplies as far as they would go, and she knew with a certainty that sat heavy in her gut that she could not last another winter out here alone. When the cold came and the supplies ran out, she would have to make a choice. Stay and die on this land that had already taken so much from her, or abandon everything and try to make her way to one of the settlements where she might find work as a seamstress or a cook or something else that would at least keep her fed and sheltered. But that decision was still months away, and Jane had learned to think only as far ahead as the next day, the next meal, the next small task that needed doing. She went inside the cabin now and dipped water from the bucket by the door, drinking deeply despite the flat, warm taste of it. The water had come from a spring 4 miles away, hauled back in heavy containers that left her shoulders aching, and she rationed it carefully because the trip to refill those containers took most of a day and left her exhausted. She was measuring out beans for her supper when she heard the sound, faint at first but growing louder, the unmistakable rhythm of horse hooves on hard ground. Jane froze, her hand still on the bean sack, and listened with every sense suddenly alert and focused. Riders approaching her property was never a good sign, not out here, not when she was alone and vulnerable and too far from any help to matter. She moved quickly to the corner where the rifle stood propped against the wall, checked that it was loaded, and then went to the door and opened it just enough to see out. 2 horses were coming up the long approach to her cabin, moving slowly, and even from a distance Jane could tell something was wrong. The horses were being led rather than ridden, their heads down and their pace unsteady, and there was something draped across each saddle, something that looked like bodies. And Jane felt her stomach tighten as she realized what she was seeing. The horses were wandering without direction, following some instinct that had brought them to her property, and the figures slumped across their backs were not moving. Jane stepped out of the cabin with the rifle in her hands, her heart pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The horses kept coming, and as they drew closer, Jane could see that they were Indian ponies, small and tough and painted with markings she recognized as Comanche. The bodies across the saddles were young men, both of them dressed in traditional clothing, leather leggings and shirts decorated with beadwork and fringe, and there was blood. so much blood that it had soaked through their clothing and dripped down to stain the horses' sides. The horses stopped when they reached the yard, too exhausted to go any farther, and Jane approached slowly, with the rifle still ready, but pointed down. She could see now that both young men were still breathing, their chests rising and falling in shallow, labored movements, but they were clearly in terrible condition. One of them had an arrow wound in his side, the shaft broken off, but the head still buried deep in the muscle. The other had been shot, a bullet wound in his shoulder that had bled heavily and was still seeping red into the fabric of his shirt. Jane stood there in the yard, with the dying sun behind her and these two wounded strangers before her, and she felt the weight of an impossible decision settling onto her shoulders. Everything she had been taught, everything she had heard from other settlers, everything that passed for wisdom on this frontier, told her to turn away, to let the horses wander on, to not get involved in Indian business that could bring nothing but trouble to her door. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to fire a shot in the air to scare the horses away, and then go back inside her cabin and pretend she had never seen them. But Jane had never been able to look at suffering and turn away from it. Not when she had the power to help, and these were not warriors riding to attack her. These were wounded boys, barely more than children, and they were dying. She could see it in the grey pallor beneath their brown skin, in the way their breathing came quick and shallow, in the amount of blood that had already been lost. If she did nothing, they would be dead by morning, and their bodies would draw scavengers, and their horses would stand guard until they too collapsed from exhaustion and thirst. Jane lowered the rifle and leaned it against the porch railing. She walked to the first horse, the one carrying the boy with the arrow wound, and spoke softly to calm the animal. The horse's eyes rolled white with fear and pain, but it stood still as Jane reached up to check on the wounded boy. He was unconscious, his head hanging down, and when Jane touched his face, she felt the burning heat of fever already setting in. The wound in his side was infected, the flesh around it swollen and hot. And Jane knew that even if she could get him down and treat him, his chances of survival were slim. The second boy was in slightly better condition, conscious enough to lift his head when Jane came close, and his eyes met hers with a look of such desperate pleading that it cut through every wall of caution and self-preservation she had built around herself. He tried to speak, his lips moving, but no sound came out except a faint whisper in a language Jane did not understand. His hand moved weakly, gesturing toward his brother, and Jane understood what he was asking. Help him, please save him. And she felt her own eyes sting with sudden tears, because she knew what this was going to cost her. She could not bring these boys into her cabin. That would be too dangerous and too difficult. But the barn, empty as it was, would provide shelter from the elements, and she had enough medical supplies to at least try to treat their wounds. It would take everything she had, her water, her food, her medicine, and if they lived, she would have to find some way to get them back to their people, and if they died, she would have to bury them. And either way, she was inviting consequences into her life that could destroy her. Jane made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She reached up and began working to ease the first boy down from his horse, moving slowly and carefully to avoid causing more damage to his wounded side. He was heavy, heavier than she expected, and she struggled under his weight as she lowered him to the ground as gently as she could. The second boy tried to help, sliding down from his own horse with a gasp of pain that left him leaning against the animal's side and shaking with the effort. It took Jane nearly an hour to get both boys into the barn, dragging them across the dusty yard one at a time, and then arranging them on piles of old straw that she spread out to make rough beds. She brought water and clean rags, and she built a small fire near the barn entrance so she would have light to work by as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. The boys lay side by side, both of them drifting in and out of consciousness, and Jane knelt between them and began the hard work of trying to save their lives. The boy with the arrow wound was named Paco, she learned later, though at that moment she knew him only as a patient who needed her care. She cut away his shirt to expose the wound, and what she saw made her stomach turn. The arrow had gone deep, and the infection had spread fast, turning the tissue around the entry point into something swollen and discolored. Jane had treated wounds before, had helped Thomas when he cut himself on barbed wire or got kicked by a horse. But this was beyond anything she had dealt with, and she knew her chances of success were poor. She heated her knife in the fire until the blade glowed red, and then she began to cut. The boy screamed when the hot metal touched his flesh, a sound that seemed to tear itself from somewhere deep in his chest, and Jane had to pin his shoulders down to keep him from thrashing while she worked. She cut away the infected tissue, digging out the arrowhead that had lodged against his rib, and the blood that came was dark and thick and smelled of corruption. She poured whiskey into the wound, the last of a bottle that Thomas had kept for medicinal purposes, and the boy screamed again, and then went limp, unconscious from the pain. The second boy, Hurit, watched everything with eyes that were too old for his young face. He had been shot in the shoulder, and the bullet had passed through clean, leaving entry and exit wounds that were easier to treat. Jane cleaned both holes with whiskey, and then packed them with clean cloth, binding the shoulder tightly to stop the bleeding. Hurit gritted his teeth through the pain but did not cry out. And when Jane was finished, he reached out with his good hand and gripped her wrist, squeezing once in what she understood as thanks. By the time Jane had done everything she could for both boys, the night had fallen completely, turning the world beyond the firelight into a wall of darkness. She sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands stained with blood and her dress soaked with sweat. The boys were resting now, their breathing a little easier, though Jane knew that the next few hours would tell the tale. If the fever came back strong, if the infection spread, if the wounds opened again and bled, there would be nothing more she could do. She left the barn long enough to care for the horses, giving them water from her precious supply and rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass. Copper watched from the paddock with ears pricked forward, curious about the newcomers, and Jane felt a pang of guilt as she measured out water for the Indian ponies. Every drop she gave to these horses was a drop less for Copper, and she was already running low with no easy way to replenish her supply. Jane spent that night in the barn, dozing fitfully beside the fire, checking on the boys every hour to monitor their breathing and their fever. Paco remained unconscious, his face pale and his skin burning hot, and Jane changed the dressing on his wound twice when it soaked through with seepage from the infection. Hurit drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes lucid enough to drink when Jane held a cup to his lips, sometimes delirious and murmuring in Comanche while his eyes tracked things that were not there. Sometime before dawn, Jane finally fell into a deeper sleep, and she dreamed of Thomas, of the way he used to smile at her across the dinner table, of the sound of his voice when he read to her from the Bible on Sunday evenings, of the warmth of his hand in hers when they lay together in the darkness. In her dream, he was trying to tell her something important, but she could not make out the words, and she woke with a start to find the first grey light of morning seeping through the cracks in the barn walls. Both boys were still alive, and that felt like a miracle in itself. Jane checked their wounds again, relieved to find that Paco's fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving him weak but no longer burning with that terrible heat. Hurit was awake, watching her with dark eyes that held a mixture of wariness and gratitude. And when Jane offered him water, he drank deeply and then spoke again in Comanche, words she still could not understand, but that she recognized as questions. Jane went to the cabin and brought back food, the last of her beans and some hardtack soaked in water to make it soft enough to chew. She fed both boys small amounts, worried about overwhelming their systems, and they ate with the desperate hunger of people who had not had a meal in days. While they ate, Jane sat and thought about what came next, about how she was going to manage this situation she had gotten herself into. The smart thing would be to get the boys strong enough to travel, and then send them on their way, back to wherever they had come from, back to their people who would take care of them, and leave Jane to continue her solitary existence on this dying ranch. But Jane knew it was not going to be that simple, knew that she had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and that the consequences of her choice were already in motion. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have guessed as she sat in that barn with two wounded Comanche boys and watched the sun rise on another brutal day, was that those consequences would arrive much sooner than she expected, and that they would come with the thunder of 200 horses and enough warriors to wipe out every settler for 50 miles in any direction. The second day brought challenges that Jane had not anticipated, and chief among them was the simple matter of keeping her patients alive while her own resources dwindled to almost nothing. She woke before dawn in the barn, her back aching from sleeping on the hard ground, and found Paco thrashing weakly in the grip of another fever spike. His wound had reopened during the night, seeping fresh blood through the bandages Jane had so carefully applied. And when she peeled back the dressing to examine it, the smell that rose from the infected flesh made her gag. She had used the last of her whiskey the night before, and now she had nothing left to clean the wound except water and soap made from lye and animal fat. Jane boiled water over the fire, waiting impatiently for it to cool enough that she could use it without scalding the boy's already damaged tissue. And while she waited, she turned her attention to Hewitt. The younger brother was in better condition, his shoulder wound showing signs of healing despite the trauma of the bullet's passage through muscle and sinew. He was awake and alert, watching Jane with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face and her movements. When Jane spoke to him, asking simple questions in English that she knew he probably could not understand, Hewitt remained silent. But his eyes followed her everywhere, tracking her as she moved between the two makeshift beds, and there was something in his gaze that spoke of intelligence and understanding even across the barrier of language. Jane found herself talking anyway, narrating what she was doing as she worked, explaining that she was going to clean his brother's wound again, that she was worried about infection, that she needed them both to drink as much water as they could manage. Hewitt surprised her by responding, not in English, but in Comanche, a long stream of words delivered in a low voice that carried weight and urgency. Jane could not understand the meaning, but she recognized the tone. He was worried about Paco, asking questions about his brother's condition, and Jane did the only thing she could do. She reached out and placed her hand on Hewitt's good shoulder, meeting his eyes directly. And she nodded once to try to convey reassurance, even though she had no idea if Paco would survive the next 24 hours. The day wore on with agonizing slowness, measured out in small tasks that consumed enormous effort. Jane changed Paco's bandages 3 times, each time revealing a wound that looked marginally better than before, as if her stubborn refusal to let him die was somehow communicating itself to his body and forcing it to heal. She coaxed both boys to drink water, spoonful by spoonful, knowing that dehydration could kill them just as surely as infection. She rationed out tiny portions of her remaining food, giving most of it to Hewitt, since he was conscious and able to eat. And she tried not to think about the fact that her own supplies were now dangerously low. By mid-afternoon, Jane realized she had another problem. She was down to her last bucket of water, and the spring where she collected it was 4 miles away across open country. Making that trip would take most of what remained of the day, and it would mean leaving the boys alone and unguarded for hours. The thought of abandoning them made her stomach clench with anxiety, but the alternative was worse. Without water, they would all die. And that was a certainty Jane could not ignore. She made her preparations quickly. Gathering the empty containers she would need to transport water, checking the rifle to make sure it was loaded and ready in case she encountered trouble on the trail. Before she left, she knelt beside Hewitt and tried to explain through gestures and pantomime that she was going for water, that she would be back before dark, that he needed to watch over his brother while she was gone. Hewitt seemed to understand, or at least he nodded in a way that suggested comprehension. and his hand moved to grip her wrist again, in that gesture she had come to recognize as his way of saying thank you. The journey to the spring was brutal under the afternoon sun. The heat rising off the ground in visible waves that distorted the horizon and made everything shimmer like water that was not really there. Jane led Copper, loading the mare with the empty containers that would be heavy on the return trip. And she walked with the rifle slung across her back and her eyes constantly scanning the landscape for any sign of danger. This was Comanche territory, had always been Comanche territory despite the legal fictions that said otherwise. And Jane knew that she was vulnerable out here alone. A single woman on foot with nothing but a horse and a gun to protect her, she reached the spring without incident, though the journey took longer than she remembered and left her exhausted and shaking. The spring itself was little more than a seep in a rock formation, water trickling out at a rate that meant Jane had to wait while each container slowly filled. She sat in the shade of an overhanging boulder and tried to rest, but her mind would not stop racing through all the ways this situation could go wrong. What if Paco died while she was gone? What if Hurit's wound became infected? What if someone had seen the Indian ponies at her property and was even now riding to gather a group of settlers to come investigate? What if the boys' people were looking for them and tracked them to Jane's ranch and decided she was responsible for their condition? The list of potential disasters was endless, and Jane forced herself to stop thinking about them and focus instead on the immediate task of filling her containers and getting back to the ranch before dark. The sun was already sinking toward the western horizon by the time she had enough water, and the return journey was going to be slow with copper laden down and the containers sloshing with every step. Jane secured everything as best she could, double-checking the knots and the balance of the load, and then she started back the way she had come, with a growing sense of urgency pushing her forward. She was still an hour from home when she saw the dust on the horizon, a thin plume rising into the still air in a way that could only mean riders, and lots of them. Jane's heart seized in her chest, and she instinctively looked for cover. But there was none, just open prairie stretching away in every direction with nowhere to hide. She kept moving, angling slightly south to put more distance between herself and whoever was raising that dust. And she prayed that they had not seen her, that they would pass by without noticing one small figure leading a horse across the vastness of this empty land. But the dust cloud changed direction, swinging around to intercept her path, and Jane knew with a sick certainty that she had been spotted. She stopped and unslung the rifle from her back, checking again that it was loaded, knowing even as she did so that one rifle against multiple riders was no defense at all. If these were hostile Indians, she was dead. If they were settlers who had heard about the Comanche boys at her ranch, she might be arrested, or worse. Either way, her chances of making it home alive had just dropped to almost nothing. The riders resolved out of the heat shimmer, taking shape as they drew closer, and Jane felt her breath catch when she saw what was coming toward her. 5 Comanche warriors on painted ponies, riding in a loose formation that spoke of confidence and complete control of this territory. They were armed with rifles and bows, dressed in traditional clothing that marked them as men of status within their tribe. And they rode with the easy grace of people who had been born on horseback and would probably die the same way. Jane stood her ground because running would be pointless, and she kept the rifle pointed down in a non-threatening position while the riders circled around her, their horses kicking up more dust that hung in the air like smoke. The warriors studied her with expressions that gave away nothing, and Jane studied them back, trying to assess whether she was looking at men who would kill her, or men who might listen to what she had to say. One of them, older than the others with grey streaking through his long black hair, urged his horse forward until he was close enough that Jane could see the deep lines etched into his face by years of sun and wind. He spoke to her in Comanche, a question that Jane could not understand, and when she shook her head to indicate incomprehension, he switched to English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear. He asked her who she was, what she was doing out here alone, whether she had seen any wounded men in her travels. Jane made a decision in that moment, a decision to tell the truth, because lies would only make things worse. And she took a breath and told the warrior that her name was Jane Rivers, that she lived on a ranch 2 hours north of here, and that, yes, she had found 2 wounded boys and was currently caring for them in her barn. The effect of her words was immediate and electric. All 5 warriors straightened in their saddles, and the older man leaned forward with an intensity that made Jane take an involuntary step backward. He fired questions at her in rapid succession, demanding to know if the boys were alive, what their wounds looked like, whether she had helped them or harmed them. Jane answered as quickly as she could, describing Paco's arrow wound and the infection she had been fighting, explaining Hurit's bullet wound and the fact that he was conscious and healing, telling them that she had done everything in her power to keep both boys alive. The warriors spoke among themselves in their own language, a heated discussion that Jane could not follow. And she stood there holding Copper's lead rope and trying not to show the fear that was making her hands shake. These men could kill her right here and take the horse and the water, and no one would ever know what had happened to her. Or they could take her back to their village and decide her fate there. And Jane had heard enough stories about what happened to white women captured by Indians to know that death might be the kindest outcome she could hope for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the older warrior turned back to her and said something that Jane had not expected. He told her that the boys she was caring for were the sons of Mamanti, a chief of the Penteca Comanche, and that the entire band had been searching for them since they disappeared 3 days ago during a raid that had gone wrong. He said that Mamanti would want to see his sons, would want to judge for himself whether this white woman's care had been genuine or some kind of trick. And he said that Jane needed to take them to the ranch immediately so that the chief could be brought there. Jane nodded, knowing she had no real choice in the matter, and she started walking with the 5 warriors, riding in formation around her, like guards or captors or both. The journey back to her ranch took on a surreal quality, the landscape that she knew so well suddenly feeling alien and dangerous with these armed men flanking her on all sides. They did not speak to her again during the ride, but Jane could feel their eyes on her constantly, watching for any sign of deception or treachery, and she kept her own gaze fixed straight ahead and concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. By the time they reached her property, the sun had set completely, and the first stars were appearing in a sky that stretched overhead like a dark ocean. The warriors dismounted and immediately went to the barn, and Jane hurried to follow them, suddenly terrified of what they might do when they saw the condition of the boys. But when they entered the barn and saw Paco and Hurit lying on their makeshift beds, the tension that had been coiling tighter throughout the journey seemed to release just slightly. Hurit called out weakly when he saw the warriors, recognition flooding his face, and he struggled to sit up, despite the pain it caused him. One of the younger warriors rushed forward and knelt beside him, gripping his hand and speaking urgently in Comanche, and Jane watched as Hurit responded, gesturing toward her and then toward his brother, clearly explaining what had happened. The older warrior moved to Paco's side and examined the wound that Jane had been treating, peeling back the bandage with careful fingers, and his expression remained unreadable as he studied the infected flesh. Then he turned to Jane and asked her a question that she had not anticipated. He asked her why she had helped them, why a white woman living alone would risk everything to care for 2 Comanche boys who were nothing to her, enemies according to the logic of the frontier. Jane thought about how to answer, searching for words that would convey the simple truth of it. And finally she just said that they were hurt and she knew how to help, and she could not turn away from suffering when she had the power to ease it. The warrior studied her face as if looking for lies, and whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly and spoke again. He told Jane that he was called Takoda, that he was Mamanti's brother and the uncle of these boys, and that he would be staying here with 2 other warriors, while the remaining 2 rode to bring Mamanti to see his sons. He said it would take most of the night for them to reach the main camp and return, and he said that Jane should rest because tomorrow would bring decisions that would affect all of their lives. Jane did not ask what kind of decisions he meant, but she felt the weight of them settling over her like a physical thing. She showed the warriors where they could water their horses and offered them food from her meager supplies, which they accepted with grave courtesy that surprised her. They built up the fire in the barn and settled in to watch over the boys. And Jane finally allowed herself to go back to her cabin and collapse onto her bed, with exhaustion dragging her down into darkness. She did not sleep well, her dreams filled with visions of Thomas and memories of better times, and she woke several times during the night to the sound of horses moving in the yard and men speaking in low voices in a language she did not understand. Each time she woke, Jane felt the urge to go check on Paco and Huret, but she forced herself to stay in the cabin because she knew the warriors would not welcome her interference. They were caring for their own now, and Jane had done all she could do. The third dawn came with a coolness that was almost pleasant, the air still holding some of the night's chill before the sun rose high enough to turn everything back into an oven. Jane dressed and went outside to find Takoda standing near the paddock, watching Copper with an expression of appreciation that any horseman would recognize. He turned when he heard Jane approach, and for the first time since they had met, he smiled, a brief expression that transformed his stern face into something warmer and more human. He told Jane that her mare was very fine, that she showed the training of someone who understood horses, and he asked if the animal had been her husband's. Jane confirmed that Copper had belonged to Thomas, that he had raised her from a filly and trained her with patience and skill, and Takoda nodded as if this explained something important. Then he said something that made Jane's blood run cold. He said that Mamanti would be arriving soon, probably within the hour, and that he would be bringing warriors with him, many warriors, and that Jane should prepare herself for what was coming. Jane asked what she should prepare for, but Takoda just shook his head and said that it was not his place to speak of it, that Mamanti would decide what happened next, and that all Jane could do was trust that her actions in saving his nephews had earned her some measure of consideration. It was not exactly reassuring, but it was all the information Takoda seemed willing to provide, and Jane went back into her cabin to wait with her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not have to wait long, and when they came, it was with a sound like distant thunder that grew steadily louder until it filled the air and made the ground itself seem to vibrate. Jane stepped out onto her porch and saw them coming across the prairie, a force of warriors that seemed impossible in its size and coordination, dozens of riders flowing across the landscape like a single living entity, and at their head rode a man who could only be Mamanti. He was not the largest of the warriors, but he carried himself with an authority that needed no announcement, and even from a distance Jane could see the resemblance to his sons in the shape of his face and the set of his shoulders. The riders spread out as they approached her property, surrounding it on all sides, and Jane understood with perfect clarity that she was looking at enough warriors to destroy every settlement in this part of Texas if they chose to do so. They had come for their own, and whether Jane lived or died would depend entirely on what Mamanti decided when he saw his sons. The chief dismounted in her yard, and the other warriors followed his lead, creating a semicircle of armed men that faced Jane's cabin like a wall of judgment. Takoda went to meet his brother, speaking rapidly in Comanche and gesturing toward the barn, and Mamanti listened without interruption before turning his gaze toward Jane. His eyes were dark and penetrating, and Jane met them without flinching, even though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to show submission, to do anything that might improve her chances of survival. Mamanti walked past her without speaking, heading straight for the barn, and Jane followed with her legs feeling like water beneath her. Inside the barn, Hewritt saw his father and tried again to rise, calling out with tears streaming down his face, and Mamanti went to him immediately, kneeling beside the makeshift bed and gathering his younger son into an embrace that spoke of relief and love and terrible worry. Then he moved to Paco, who was still unconscious but breathing steadily, and Jane watched as the chief examined his older son's wound with hands that were surprisingly gentle. When Mamanti finally turned to face Jane, his expression was unreadable, and he spoke to her in English that was more fluent than Takoda's, asking her to tell him everything that had happened from the moment his sons had arrived at her property. Jane told the story as simply and honestly as she could, leaving out nothing, explaining her decision to help despite the risks, describing the treatment she had provided, acknowledging that she had used her last supplies to keep the boys alive. Mamanti listened without interrupting, and when Jane finished, he asked her one question that cut straight to the heart of everything. He asked her what she wanted in return for saving his sons, what payment she expected, what reward she thought she had earned. And Jane looked at this powerful chief, surrounded by his warriors, in her barn on her dying ranch. And she told him the truth. She said she wanted nothing, that she had helped because it was the right thing to do, and that she asked only to be left in peace, to continue her life here. The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch forever, and Jane could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears as she waited for Mamanti's response. Knowing that her fate, and possibly the fate of every settler in the region, hung on what this man decided in the next few moments, Mamanti's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes studying Jane's face with an intensity that seemed to look past her words and into her very soul. The barn had grown crowded with warriors who had followed their chief inside, and Jane could feel the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her like a physical force. These men had ridden through the night to reach this place, driven by fear for their chief's sons and rage at whoever had harmed them. And now they stood waiting for Mamanti to pronounce judgment on the white woman who had inserted herself into their world. Finally, the chief spoke, and his words were deliberate and careful, chosen with the precision of a man who understood that language could be as powerful as any weapon. He told Jane that among his people a life debt was a sacred thing, not to be taken lightly or dismissed with simple gratitude. His sons had been dying when they reached her property, and without her intervention they would certainly have perished on this unforgiving prairie, their spirits wandering lost because their bodies had not been properly honored. By saving them, Jane had placed Mamanti in a position that demanded reciprocation, and the nature of that reciprocation would be determined by what she truly needed, not by what she claimed to want. Jane started to protest that she genuinely wanted nothing, but Mamanti raised his hand in a gesture that silenced her as effectively as if he had spoken. He said that he had been observing her property since his arrival, that his warriors had been watching her for weeks before his sons ever stumbled onto her land, and that he knew exactly how precarious her situation had become. He knew about the dried creek and the failed crops, about the dead livestock and the empty stores. He knew she was alone here, a widow struggling to survive on land that was slowly killing her through drought and isolation and the accumulated weight of loss. The accuracy of his assessment shocked Jane into silence, and she realized with a chill that she had been living under surveillance without ever knowing it. That Comanche eyes had been tracking her movements and evaluating her circumstances while she went about her daily routine, believing herself to be unobserved. It should have frightened her, and part of her was terrified by the implications, but another part recognized it for what it was, evidence that she existed in a world far more complex than the simple binary of settler versus savage that most white people believed in. Mamanti continued speaking, and his words took on a philosophical quality that surprised Jane with its depth. He said that his people had lived on this land for generations beyond counting, that they knew every water source and every game trail, every place where plants grew that could heal wounds or ease hunger. He said the Comanche understood better than any white settler ever could how to survive in country that seemed determined to break those who tried to tame it. And he said that Jane's ranch, sitting as it did on the edge of traditional Comanche territory, represented a kind of bridge between two worlds that were usually at war. He told her that he had a proposal, something unprecedented in the history of his band's dealings with white settlers, and something that would be controversial among both their peoples if word of it spread. He said that Jane would be permitted to remain on her land, and more than that, she would be provided with assistance to make the ranch viable again. His warriors would bring her meat from their hunts, and his women would teach her which plants could be harvested from the prairie to supplement her diet. They would show her a spring that ran year-round in a hidden canyon 3 miles from her property, a place the Comanche had used for centuries, but which white settlers had never discovered. In exchange, Jane's ranch would become a neutral ground, a place where injured or sick Comanche could come for help without fear of being shot on sight. The proposal was so unexpected and so radical that Jane struggled to process all its implications. What Mamanti was offering was essentially a treaty between one white woman and an entire Comanche band, an arrangement that flew in the face of everything both cultures believed about how they should interact with each other. If other settlers learned that Jane was providing aid to Indians, she would be branded a traitor and likely killed or driven from the territory. If the Comanche warriors who opposed any cooperation with whites discovered the arrangement, both she and Mamanti could face violent resistance from within his own people. But Jane also recognized the wisdom in what he was proposing, and the desperate necessity that made it worth the enormous risks. She was going to die out here if something did not change, and Mamanti's people would continue to suffer casualties from raids and conflicts that left their wounded with no real options for treatment. By creating this neutral ground, this small pocket of cooperation in a landscape defined by hostility, they might both survive a little longer and a little better. It was pragmatic and dangerous and probably doomed to failure, but it was also the only lifeline being offered. And Jane had never been foolish enough to refuse help when she truly needed it. She asked Mamanti what would happen when word inevitably got out. When other settlers or soldiers or ranging companies discovered what was happening at her ranch. The chief smiled grimly and said that his warriors would ensure no one approached her property without his knowledge, and that anyone who threatened the arrangement would be dealt with swiftly and permanently. It was not entirely reassuring, since it meant Jane would be living under constant Comanche surveillance. But it was at least a form of protection, and she supposed she should be grateful for that. Jane took a deep breath and extended her hand to Mamanti in the white custom of sealing an agreement, and after a moment's hesitation, the chief gripped her hand firmly. His palm was calloused and hard from a lifetime of riding and fighting, but his handshake was steady and direct, and Jane felt the weight of the commitment they had just made to each other settle onto her shoulders like a yoke she would carry for the rest of her life. The warriors who had crowded into the barn began to relax visibly once the agreement was made, and Jane realized that many of them had been poised for violence, ready to kill her if their chief gave the order. Now that order would not come, and the tension drained from the space like water flowing out of a broken vessel. Takoda stepped forward and spoke to Mamanti in Comanche, gesturing toward Paco, and the chief nodded and replied before turning back to Jane. He told her that his sons would remain at her ranch for another week while they recovered enough strength to travel, and that during that time several warriors would stay to help with the work that needed doing around the property. Jane wanted to protest that she could manage on her own, but she bit back the words because she knew they were not true, and because accepting help was part of the bargain she had just struck. Mamanti seemed to read her reluctance in her face, and he said something that struck Jane as profound in its simplicity. He said that strength was not measured by how much weight you could carry alone, but by how wisely you chose who to share your burdens with. Over the next several days, Jane's ranch underwent a transformation that seemed almost miraculous. The Comanche warriors who stayed behind threw themselves into work with an efficiency that came from generations of people who understood how to wring survival from harsh land. They rode out each morning and returned with game, deer and rabbits, and even a young pronghorn that provided more meat than Jane had seen in months. They showed her how to preserve the meat by cutting it into thin strips and drying it in the sun, creating jerky that would last through the winter without spoiling. 3 Comanche women arrived on the 4th day, appearing without announcement or fanfare, as if they had simply materialized from the prairie itself. They were Mamante's sisters. Jane learned through the halting translation provided by Takoda, and they had come to teach her the knowledge that white settlers usually scorned as primitive superstition. The women spoke no English, but they communicated through gestures and demonstrations, leading Jane out onto the prairie and showing her plants she had walked past 100 times without recognizing their value. There were roots that could be ground into flour to make a kind of bread, and leaves that, when boiled, created a tea that helped with stomach ailments. There were berries that grew in shaded drawers, hidden from casual observation, but abundant once you knew where to look. There were herbs that could reduce fever and poultices that drew infection from wounds, and the women showed Jane how to identify each plant and harvest it properly and prepare it for use. It was an education that contradicted everything Jane had been taught about this land being empty and barren, and she began to understand that her failure to thrive here had been partly a failure of knowledge rather than simply bad luck. Paco's recovery accelerated once his father's people took over his care, and Jane watched with professional interest as they applied treatments she had never encountered. They used a paste made from crushed plants to draw out the last of the infection from his wound, and they sang over him in the evenings, long rhythmic chants that seemed to reach something deep inside him and pull him back from the edge of death he had been hovering near. Jane did not understand the mechanism by which the singing worked, but she could not deny the results, and within 3 days Paco was sitting up and taking solid food, and talking with his brother in quiet voices that carried the relief of 2 people who had survived something terrible together. Urit healed faster, his youth and his less serious wound combining to speed his recovery, and he took to following Jane around the property whenever she went outside. At first, she found his constant presence unsettling, but gradually she came to appreciate the company after so many months of solitude. He would sit and watch while she worked, occasionally helping with small tasks when his injured shoulder allowed. And sometimes he would practice English words that Takoda had been teaching him, testing them out on Jane and grinning when she confirmed he had pronounced them correctly. One evening, as Jane was preparing the nightly meal over the outdoor fire pit the warriors had built, Urit approached her with something clutched in his good hand. He held it out to her with a shy formality that made him seem even younger than his 16 years, and Jane saw that it was a piece of turquoise, beautifully polished and wrapped with thin leather cord to make a pendant. Through a combination of his broken English and her growing understanding of gesture, Urit explained that his mother had made it, and that he wanted Jane to have it as a token of gratitude for saving both his and his brother's lives. Jane tried to refuse, saying the gift was too valuable and that she had only done what anyone would do. But Urit insisted with a quiet determination that reminded her of his father. Finally, she accepted the pendant and placed it around her neck, and the boy's face lit up with a smile so genuine and unguarded that Jane felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had given her anything, so long since she had felt valued for something beyond just her ability to endure, and the simple kindness of this gesture cracked something open inside her that she had been keeping carefully locked away. The warriors showed Jane the hidden spring on the 6th day, leading her through terrain she thought she knew, but revealing pathways and landmarks she had never noticed. The spring emerged from a rock formation at the base of a small canyon. flowing clear and cold, even in the height of summer drought. And the pool it formed was surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. The Comanche had built a small cairn beside the water, a marker that indicated this was a sacred place. And Takoda explained through his careful English that they were trusting Jane with knowledge that could be used against them if she chose to betray their confidence. Jane understood the weight of what was being offered, and she made a silent vow, standing there beside that life-giving water, that she would never reveal its location to another white person, that this secret would be kept even if it cost her everything. The warriors seemed to sense her sincerity, and they showed her the safest route to reach the spring from her property, a path that stayed concealed in draws and behind ridgelines, so that anyone traveling it would be nearly invisible to casual observation. On the 7th day, Mamanti returned with 12 more warriors and several pack horses loaded with supplies. There were bags of corn and dried beans, blankets woven from buffalo wool, and cooking implements that Jane's kitchen had been lacking. There was also a young heifer, barely more than a calf, that the warriors herded into Jane's empty paddock alongside Copper. Mamanti explained that the heifer was pregnant and would calve in the spring, giving Jane the beginning of a new herd if she could keep the animal alive through the winter. But the most significant gift was the last one to be revealed, and it took Jane several moments to understand what she was seeing when the warriors led out a horse from among their group. It was a young stallion, beautifully conformed with a dark coat that gleamed like polished wood, and Mamanti explained that this animal was being given to Jane to replace the mare she was about to lose. Jane started to protest that she was not losing Copper, that the mare was hers and would remain so. But Mamanti cut her off with a raised hand and a look that brooked no argument. He told her that his sons were well enough to travel, and that they would be leaving today to return to the main Comanche camp. But they could not make that journey on foot, and the 2 Indian ponies that had brought them to Jane's property had been ridden nearly to death, and needed weeks of rest before they would be fit for hard travel. The only horse at Jane's ranch that was strong enough and well-trained enough for the journey was Copper, and Mamanti was not asking for the mare. He was telling Jane that he was taking her, and that the stallion was fair compensation for the loss. Jane felt her world tilt sideways, and for a moment she could not breathe around the panic that seized her chest. Copper was the last piece of Thomas she had left, the last tangible connection to the life they had tried to build together, and the thought of losing the mare was almost more than she could bear. She opened her mouth to refuse, to say that Mamanti could take anything else but not the horse, not Copper. But the words died in her throat when she saw Paco and Hurit standing beside their father. Both boys were dressed for travel, their wounds bandaged and their faces showing the gauntness of their ordeal, but also the determination of warriors who would not show weakness in front of their people. They needed a horse to carry them home, and Jane had saved their lives, and now that same choice was being asked of her again in a different form. She could refuse and keep Copper and break the fragile alliance that had been built over these past 7 days. Or she could give up the last piece of her old life and commit fully to this new path she had stumbled onto. Thomas would have told her to keep the horse, would have said that sentiment and memory were worth more than political considerations or strategic alliances. But Thomas was dead, and Jane was alive, and she had to make choices based on the reality she inhabited rather than the one she wished for. She walked to the paddock, where Copper stood watching with her ears pricked forward in curiosity, and Jane wrapped her arms around the mare's neck and buried her face in the warm horseflesh and let herself cry for just a moment, mourning everything she had lost and everything she was choosing to let go. Then she stepped back and wiped her eyes and turned to face Mamanti, and she told him in a voice that shook only slightly that he could take Copper, that the mare was his to use as he needed, and that she trusted him to treat the animal well. The chief nodded, with what might have been respect or might have been satisfaction, and he gestured to his warriors, who came forward to lead Copper from the paddock. The mare went willingly enough, accustomed to being handled by competent horsemen, and Jane had to force herself not to call out and stop them as they saddled the animal and prepared her for the journey. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Paco and Hurit came to say goodbye, both of them clasping Jane's hands in the Comanche fashion and speaking words she did not understand, but whose meaning was clear in their tone and their eyes. Takoda translated the essential message that she would always be welcome in their camp, that she had earned a place of honor among their people, and that if she ever needed help, she had only to send word and warriors would come. It was a remarkable promise, and Jane accepted it with as much grace as she could muster while her heart was breaking over the loss of her mare. The Comanche departed as suddenly as they had arrived, flowing back out onto the prairie in a loose formation that covered ground with deceptive speed. Jane watched them go, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and she saw Hurit turn in his saddle to wave one last time before the group crested a rise and disappeared from view. Then she was alone again, standing in her yard with the young stallion watching her from the paddock and the silence of the empty land pressing in from all sides. Except it was not quite the same silence as before, and Jane was not quite the same woman. The barn was full of supplies that would see her through the winter, and her head was full of knowledge about how to find food and medicine from plants she had been walking past for years. She had allies now in this harsh country, dangerous allies who could turn on her if circumstances changed, but allies nonetheless. And she had made a choice that terrified her in its finality, giving up the past to invest in an uncertain future, trading memory for survival. Jane went to the stallion and spent time getting to know the animal, running her hands over his legs to check for soundness, examining his teeth and his eyes and his overall conformation. He was young, maybe 4 years old, and beautifully trained despite his youth, responding to the lightest touch and showing none of the fractious behavior that some horses displayed around strangers. She wondered who had trained him, whether it had been Mamanti himself or one of the other expert horsemen in his band, and she felt a grudging appreciation for the skill that had gone into the animal's education. As the sun set on that 7th day, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the horizon on fire, Jane sat on her porch and took stock of her situation. She had entered into an arrangement that would scandalize every white settler in Texas if they knew about it, and she had given up the last physical reminder of her husband to seal that arrangement. She was now living under the protection and surveillance of Comanche warriors, dependent on their goodwill for her continued survival, and committed to providing medical care to people her own culture considered enemies. It should have felt like defeat, like capitulation to forces she could not control. Instead, it felt like the first real choice she had made in years, the first time since Thomas died that she had taken active control of her fate rather than just reacting to circumstances. The path ahead was dangerous and uncertain, but it was a path she had chosen with open eyes, and there was a strange kind of freedom in that clarity. Jane had burned her bridges to the life she used to know, and now she would have to learn to thrive in the new territory she had claimed for herself. The weeks that followed the departure of Mamanti and his sons brought changes to Jane's life that she could never have anticipated, transforming her isolated existence into something far more complex and precarious. The first test of the new arrangement came just 11 days after the Comanche warriors had ridden away, when Jane woke before dawn to find a man lying unconscious near her barn, his body broken and bleeding from what looked like a fall from a horse at high speed. She approached cautiously with her rifle, unsure whether this was another injured Comanche or perhaps a settler who had stumbled onto her property by accident. But as she drew closer, she recognized the traditional clothing and the distinctive hairstyle that marked him as one of Mamanti's people. The warrior was older than Paco and Hurit, perhaps in his mid-20s, and his injuries were severe enough that Jane knew immediately he would die without intervention. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee, clearly broken, and there was a gash across his forehead that had bled heavily and was still seeping red into the dirt. Jane made her decision quickly, as she had learned to do in this new life where hesitation could mean death. She managed to drag the unconscious man into the barn, a process that took all her strength and left her gasping and shaking with effort. She built up the fire and gathered her medical supplies, such as they were, and then she began the painstaking work of setting the broken leg and cleaning the head wound. The warrior regained consciousness during the worst of it, when Jane was straightening the fractured bone, and his scream of agony brought the young stallion racing to the far corner of the paddock in panic. She gave him leather to bite down on and whiskey to dull the pain, and she worked as quickly as her trembling hands would allow to splint the leg, using boards from a broken crate and strips of cloth torn from one of her few remaining blankets. The head wound required stitches, and Jane had to fight down nausea as she threaded the needle and began closing the gash with small, careful stitches that pulled the torn flesh back together. The warrior bore it all with a stoicism that impressed her, making no sound except for harsh breathing through clenched teeth. And when she was finished, he looked at her with eyes that held a mixture of pain and gratitude and something that might have been respect. Over the next 3 days, more Comanche arrived at irregular intervals, never announcing themselves, but simply appearing as if they had materialized from the prairie air. They came to check on their injured companion, bringing food and medicine prepared by their own healers, and they came to evaluate Jane and determine whether she could be trusted to uphold her end of the bargain with Mamanti. The scrutiny was intense and exhausting, and Jane felt constantly watched, even when she appeared to be alone. But she endured it because she understood that trust had to be earned through actions rather than simply granted based on promises. The injured warrior's name was Napona. She learned through the limited communication possible between people who shared no common language, and he was a respected hunter within Mamanti's band. His horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole at full gallop, sending both animal and rider tumbling in a catastrophic fall that had killed the horse instantly and left Napona with injuries that would have been fatal without treatment. The other warriors made it clear through gestures and the few English words they knew that they considered Jane's intervention a fulfillment of the agreement, and that word of her actions would reach Mamanti and strengthen the alliance between them. But the presence of so many Comanche at her ranch created new problems that Jane had not fully considered when she accepted Mamanti's proposal. Settlers did occasionally pass through this region, traveling between the scattered homesteads and the distant settlements, and sooner or later someone was going to notice the Indian ponies in her yard, or the smoke from fires that burned at unusual times. Jane began to worry constantly about discovery, about the moment when some well-meaning neighbor or suspicious soldier would ride up to her property and find evidence of her cooperation with the Comanche. Her fears were realized on a bright morning in early autumn when she heard the approach of horses from the south and looked up to see 3 white men riding toward her ranch. Jane recognized them immediately as ranging company volunteers, part-time soldiers who patrolled the frontier looking for signs of Indian activity and who had authority to act with lethal force against any native people they encountered. The men were heavily armed and rode with the casual arrogance of people who believed themselves to be the legitimate law in this territory. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs as she calculated how much evidence of Comanche presence might be visible from the yard. Napona was still in the barn, unable to walk on his broken leg, and there were supplies scattered around the property that would be immediately recognizable as Indian in origin. The young stallion in the paddock was clearly Comanche trained, and Jane herself was wearing the turquoise pendant Hewlett had given her, visible against her worn dress. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the rangers reached speaking distance, and she used that time to position herself between them and the barn, blocking their direct line of sight to the entrance. The lead ranger was a man named McAllister, known throughout the region for his hatred of Indians and his tendency to shoot first and investigate later. He reined in his horse a few yards from Jane and touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy, his eyes already scanning the property with predatory interest. He asked Jane how she was managing out here alone, whether she had seen any signs of hostile Indians in the area, and whether she needed any assistance from men who understood how dangerous this territory could be for an unprotected woman. Jane forced herself to remain calm and meet McAllister's gaze directly, knowing that any sign of nervousness would increase his suspicion. She told him she was managing fine, that she had seen no Indians except at great distance, and that she appreciated his concern but did not require assistance. McAllister smiled at her answer, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the cold calculation of a man who sensed something wrong, but could not yet identify what it was. He asked about the horse in her paddock, commenting that it looked like Comanche breeding, and Jane felt sweat trickle down her spine despite the cool morning air. She explained that she had traded for the stallion with a passing merchant, that her own mare had gone lame and had to be put down, and that she needed reliable transportation to reach the distant spring where she collected water. The lie came smoothly enough, but Jane could see that McAllister was not entirely convinced, and he dismounted despite her clear wish that he would simply ride on. The other two rangers followed his lead, and suddenly Jane's yard felt very small and very exposed, with 3 armed men spreading out to examine her property more closely. One of the rangers walked toward the barn, and Jane knew with absolute certainty that if he looked inside and saw Napona lying there with his broken leg and his traditional clothing, everything would be over in seconds. The rangers would kill the injured warrior, and probably Jane as well for harboring him, and word would spread throughout the territory that her ranch was a nest of Indian sympathizers. She had to stop him from entering that barn, but she had no idea how to do it without making the situation worse. Then she heard a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked, and she turned to see McAllister pointing his weapon not at her, but at something behind her. Jane spun around and saw what he had spotted, a thin line of smoke rising from the barn's far corner where the fire must have flared up when the wind shifted. It was evidence of recent occupation, and McAllister's face split into a grin that was more like a wolf's snarl than any human expression of pleasure. He called out to his companions that there was someone in the barn, and all 3 rangers raised their weapons and began advancing toward the building with the coordinated movement of men who had done this kind of work before. Jane stepped into their path and told them to stop, that there was no one in the barn, that the smoke was from a small fire she had built earlier to heat water for washing. But McAllister pushed past her roughly, knocking her aside with enough force that she stumbled and nearly fell, and then he was at the barn entrance with his rifle raised and his finger on the trigger. What happened next occurred so quickly that Jane barely had time to process it before it was over. A figure appeared behind McAllister, rising from a crouch near the barn's exterior wall, where he must have been concealed in the shadows, and Jane recognized Dakota an instant before the Comanche warrior struck the ranger across the back of the head with a war club that appeared in his hand as if conjured from air. McAllister dropped without a sound, his body crumpling to the dirt, and before his companions could react, more warriors appeared from positions around the property where they had apparently been watching and waiting. The 2 remaining rangers found themselves surrounded by 6 armed Comanche who had materialized from concealment with such speed and silence that they might as well have been spirits. The rangers' rifles were torn from their hands before they could fire a shot, and they were forced to their knees in Jane's yard, with weapons pointed at their heads from 3 different directions. Jane stood frozen, trying to understand how she had failed to notice the presence of so many warriors on her own property, and gradually realizing that she had been under much heavier guard than she had known. Takoda spoke to her in his careful English, explaining that Mamanti had ordered constant surveillance of her ranch to ensure that no harm came to her and no one discovered the arrangement they had made. The warriors had been watching when the rangers approached, and they had prepared to intervene if the situation became dangerous. Now they had a different problem. 3 white men who knew there were Comanche at Jane's property, and Takoda asked her what she thought should be done with them. The question hung in the air like a blade, and Jane understood that she was being asked to make a choice that would define the kind of person she was going to be in this new life. The easy answer, the safe answer, would be to let the warriors kill the rangers and bury the bodies where they would never be found, eliminating the threat of exposure in the most permanent way possible. But Jane looked at the 3 men kneeling in the dirt, terrified and helpless despite all their weapons and their swagger, and she could not bring herself to order their deaths. She told Takoda that killing them would only make things worse, that when the rangers failed to return there, companions would come looking for them, and that the result would be an escalation of violence that could destroy everything they had built. Instead, she proposed something different. The rangers would be escorted far to the north, beyond the usual boundaries of their patrol area, and released with a warning that if they ever came back to this region or spoke about what they had seen, they would not be allowed to leave a second time. It was a risk, trusting that the men's fear would keep them silent, but it was a risk Jane was willing to take if it meant avoiding more bloodshed. Takoda considered her proposal for a long moment, then nodded and spoke rapidly in Comanche to the other warriors. McAllister had regained consciousness by this point, and he glared at Jane with such pure hatred that she took an involuntary step backward, but he said nothing as the warriors bound all 3 rangers and loaded them onto their horses. Takoda told Jane that the men would be taken 3 days' ride to the north and released near a settlement where they could find help, and that they would be told in terms they could not misunderstand what would happen if they violated the terms of their release. The warriors departed with their prisoners, leaving Jane alone in her yard, with Napona still concealed in the barn, and her hands shaking with delayed reaction to how close she had come to disaster. She went to check on the injured hunter and found him awake and watching her with an expression she could not read. And she wondered what he thought of the white woman who had just spared the lives of men who would have killed him without hesitation. They could not speak to each other directly, but Napona reached out and touched her hand briefly, and Jane understood it as acknowledgement of something that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The incident with the rangers changed something fundamental in Jane's relationship with the Comanche who guarded her property. Where before she had been an ally of convenience, someone useful but ultimately separate from their world, now she had demonstrated that she would protect them even at risk to herself, and that shifted her status in ways she only gradually came to understand. More warriors began appearing at her ranch, not just to check on injured companions, but to trade and to talk and to share news from the wider world of Comanche territory. One evening, a woman arrived accompanied by 2 warriors who treated her with evident respect, and Jane learned through Takoda's translation that this was Mamanti's eldest daughter, a healer of significant skill within their band. The woman's name was Kimmy, and she had come to examine Napona's healing leg and to teach Jane more advanced techniques for treating injuries that the frontier medicine she knew was inadequate to handle. Over the next several days, Kimmy showed Jane how to make poultices from prairie plants that reduce swelling and pain, and how to recognize the signs of internal bleeding or infection that might not be visible on the surface. The teaching sessions were conducted largely in silence, with Kimmy demonstrating techniques and Jane copying them until she could perform them smoothly, and there was something profound in this wordless transmission of knowledge between women who inhabited such different worlds. Jane found herself thinking about her own mother, dead now for more than a decade, and wondering what she would think of her daughter learning healing arts from a Comanche woman in a barn on the edge of nowhere. It would have scandalized her. Mother's Missouri sensibilities, but Jane thought there might also have been a grudging respect for the practical wisdom of adapting to circumstances rather than clinging to rigid principles. Napona's leg healed slowly but steadily under Kimmy's. Expert care combined with Jane's attentive nursing, and after 6 weeks he was able to walk with the aid of a crutch carved from cottonwood. The day he left, making his way awkwardly but independently to where his fellow warriors waited with horses, he spoke directly to Jane in Comanche, a long speech delivered with formal gravity that Dakota translated piece by piece. Napona said that he owed Jane his life twice over, once for her medical treatment and once for her mercy toward the rangers who would have killed him, and that he would carry that debt with honor for the rest of his days. He said that if she ever needed a warrior's protection or a hunter's skill, she had only to call his name, and he would come. It was the kind of pledge that might have sounded melodramatic or empty if delivered in English between white people. But coming from Napona in his own language and his own cultural context, it carried a weight and sincerity that moved Jane more than she wanted to admit. She watched him ride away with his companions, and she felt the strange sensation of having family again. Not family by blood or marriage, but family by choice and mutual obligation, and it helped fill some of the emptiness that Thomas's death had left in her life. Autumn deepened into the first cold winds of approaching winter, and Jane's ranch settled into rhythms that would have been unrecognizable to the woman she had been just a few months earlier. She rose each morning and tended to the young stallion, who she had named Thunder for the sound his hooves made when he ran, and she checked the heifer that was growing larger with its unborn calf. She harvested the plants that Kimmy and the other Comanche women had shown her, drying them and storing them in labeled bundles that hung from her cabin ceiling. She practiced the healing techniques she had learned, sometimes on herself when she suffered minor injuries, and she felt herself becoming more competent and confident in skills that white medicine barely acknowledged. Settlers continued to pass through occasionally, and Jane became adept at reading the signs of approaching visitors in time to hide any evidence of Comanche presence. She learned which warriors were watching her property on any given day by subtle indicators they left. A specific arrangement of stones near the creek bed or a particular type of wood in the fire pit. And she began to feel less like she was being surveilled and more like she was being protected. The distinction mattered, even if the practical reality was much the same. One cold November morning, Jane woke to find Mamanti himself sitting on her porch, wrapped in a buffalo robe against the chill and watching the sunrise with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. She invited him inside for coffee, which he accepted with the same grave courtesy he brought to all his interactions with her. And they sat at her small table while steam rose from their cups, and the morning light gradually filled the cabin through its single window. Mamanti told her that winter would be hard this year, that his people's scouts had seen signs in the behavior of animals, and the patterns of clouds that indicated heavy snow and bitter cold ahead. He said that Jane should prepare herself for a season of isolation even more complete than what she had already experienced, because travel would become dangerous or impossible for weeks at a time once the storms began. He offered to have supplies brought to her ranch before the worst weather arrived, enough food and firewood to see her through until spring, and Jane accepted because she knew her own preparations were inadequate. But the chief had another reason for his visit, and he approached it with obvious discomfort that sat strangely on a man of his authority and confidence. He told Jane that there were those among his people who opposed the arrangement he had made with her, warriors who believed that any cooperation with whites was betrayal of Comanche principles and weakness in leadership. These warriors had not yet acted against the agreement. But Mamanti feared they might choose to do so during the winter, when travel was difficult, and he could not easily protect Jane's ranch with the constant surveillance she had enjoyed during milder weather. He said that he could offer her sanctuary in the Comanche camp if she felt unsafe remaining at her ranch alone, that she would be given a place of honor and treated as a guest rather than a captive. It was an extraordinary offer, and Jane recognized it as such. But she also knew that accepting it would mean abandoning her property for months and possibly forever if she could not return before other settlers claimed it. She thought about it carefully while Mamanti waited in patient silence. And finally she told him that she would stay on her ranch and take her chances with whatever winter brought. The chief nodded as if this was the answer he had expected, and he rose to leave with his coffee barely touched. At the door, he paused and turned back to say one more thing, delivered in English that was clearer and more fluent than he usually displayed. He told Jane that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face danger despite being afraid, and that she had shown more of that particular kind of courage than many warriors he had known. Then he was gone, walking out into the cold morning and mounting his horse in one fluid motion. And Jane stood in her doorway and watched him ride away toward the invisible camp where his people waited. She closed the door against the wind and looked around her cabin, seeing it with fresh eyes as both sanctuary and prison. The place that had nearly killed her with loneliness and hardship, but had also become the center of the most important relationships in her life. Winter was coming and trouble was coming with it. And Jane had no way of knowing whether she would survive either one, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would face whatever came on her own terms, and in this place she had chosen to make her stand. Winter descended on the Texas prairie with a ferocity that seemed personal, as if the land itself had decided to test Jane's resolve to remain in this place that had claimed so much from her already. The first major storm arrived 3 weeks after Mamanti's warning visit, bringing snow that fell in thick curtains and winds that howled around the cabin like living things trying to claw their way inside. Jane had prepared as well as she could with the supplies the Comanche had delivered, stacking firewood along the cabin's north wall and storing enough dried meat and grain to last several months if she rationed carefully. The isolation was profound in ways that even her lonely autumn had not prepared her for, because now there was no possibility of visitors or contact with anyone beyond the walls of her small cabin. The Comanche warriors who had been watching her property had withdrawn to their winter camp, and Jane knew she would not see another human face until the weather broke enough to allow travel. She talked to Thunder and the pregnant heifer to keep herself from going mad with silence, carrying on one-sided conversations that the animals tolerated with patient indifference. On a night 6 weeks into winter, Jane woke to sounds that did not belong in the normal catalogue of storm noises. The unmistakable crack of wood breaking and the distressed lowing of the heifer from the barn. She dressed quickly and grabbed the rifle before venturing out into darkness, so complete that she could barely see her own hands. The barn door had been torn from its hinges by accumulated ice and snow, and inside the heifer was in distress, pacing in tight circles and making sounds that Jane recognized as early labor. The animal was calving 2 months ahead of schedule, and Jane knew immediately that both cow and calf were in serious danger. She worked through the night, delivering the premature calf with hands that shook from cold and fear. When the tiny bull finally emerged after hours of agonizing work, he was not breathing, and Jane's heart sank. But she remembered a technique Thomas had shown her, and she grabbed handfuls of straw and began rubbing the calf's body vigorously, until finally he gasped and drew his first shuddering breath. Jane collapsed in exhausted relief, watching as the heifer began cleaning her newborn. And only when both animals were stable did she return to her cabin to sleep for 12 hours straight. When she woke, another massive blizzard had returned, trapping her inside for 3 more days while the storm raged with renewed violence. When the weather finally broke, Jane emerged to find the world transformed by snow and ice. It was while clearing snow from the barn that she saw smoke on the horizon, a thin column rising from the direction of the Hutchinson place. Jane wrestled with the decision for hours before loading supplies onto Thunder and setting out toward the smoke through brutal conditions that pushed both horse and rider to their limits. What she found made her stomach twist with horror. The Hutchinson house had been burned to the ground, the main building reduced to smoking ruins. Mr. Hutchinson and his 2 sons lay dead in the yard from gunshot wounds, while Mrs. Hutchinson and her daughter were nowhere to be seen. But as Jane searched the scene, something felt wrong. The bodies had been mutilated in ways meant to look like Indian savagery, but the cuts were crude and amateurish. The tracks in the snow were chaotic and disorganized, lacking the patterns Comanche warriors would leave, and there were boot prints mixed among the moccasin tracks. Jane's blood ran cold as she understood what she was really looking at. This had been staged to look like an Indian raid, but white men had carried it out, possibly rangers or militia, deliberately inflaming settler hatred to justify retaliatory violence. The Hutchinson family had been sacrificed as pawns, murdered by their own people and dressed up as victims of savage Indians. Jane knew she had to warn Mamanti immediately. She mounted Thunder and rode toward the Comanche winter camp through conditions that nearly killed them both. 2 days later, half frozen and delirious with exhaustion, she was intercepted by Comanche scouts who brought her to the camp. She was taken directly to Mamanti's lodge, where the chief sat with his advisors. Through Takoda's translation, Jane told them everything she had discovered, describing the false evidence and her certainty that white men had staged the attack. She warned that more such attacks were coming, that forces were working to manufacture a war that would justify driving the Comanche from the territory completely. Mamanti listened in grim silence, then asked why she had risked her life to bring this warning when she could have stayed safe at her ranch. Jane told him the truth, that their agreement had made her responsible for preserving the fragile peace they had built together, and that she would not watch innocent people be murdered to serve political goals. What happened next shocked everyone present. Mamanti stood and removed a necklace he wore, made from bear claws and decorated with intricate beadwork, and placed it around Jane's neck with formal ceremony. He spoke in Comanche with the weight of pronouncement, and Takoda translated that the chief had just adopted Jane into his band with all rights and protections that entailed. She had become, in their eyes, one of their people. Mamanti declared that Jane would remain in the camp until spring, that traveling back in current conditions was too dangerous. A lodge was prepared for her, and she was swept into the rhythms of Comanche winter life, learning new skills and gradually understanding the language through constant immersion. But even as Jane settled into this unexpected sanctuary, she knew spring would bring conflict that might destroy everything. Men like McAllister would escalate until they provoked the war they wanted, and Jane's position between two worlds would become untenable. On the longest night of winter, Jane made herself a promise that she would survive whatever was coming, that she would protect the people she cared about on both sides of this divide, and that she would find a way to expose the truth before more innocent people died. Spring came eventually, melting the snow and bringing the first signs of renewal. Jane prepared to return to her ranch with a warrior escort, saying goodbye to people who had become family. Mamanti told her that scouts would watch for signs of more staged attacks, and that any information she could gather would be valuable. Jane had become, without intending it, a spy and intermediary moving between worlds. When Jane finally rode back onto her property after 4 months away, she found her ranch exactly as she had left it, but fundamentally transformed. This was no longer just her land, it had become a neutral ground where different peoples could meet, and where peace existed even amid escalating conflict. The heifer and calf had somehow survived the winter, and Jane found them both thin, but alive. She spent her first day home reacquainting herself with the space and routines, but she could not escape the knowledge that her greatest challenge still lay ahead. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jane went inside her cabin and began preparing her evening meal, moving through familiar routines, even as her mind raced ahead to all the challenges tomorrow might bring, and she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in years: hope that perhaps the future might hold possibilities beyond mere survival, that perhaps the bridge she had built between worlds might lead somewhere worth going. Spring transformed the prairie from a frozen wasteland into an ocean of wildflowers and new grass. And with that transformation came the tensions that Mamanti and Jane had been dreading throughout the long winter months. Reports reached Jane through Comanche scouts that more false flag attacks had occurred at settler homesteads to the south and east, each one carefully staged to look like Comanche raids, each one pushing the white population closer to demanding military action against all native peoples in the territory. Jane documented everything the scouts told her, keeping detailed notes in a journal she hid beneath a loose floorboard in her cabin. She began to see patterns in the attacks that suggested careful coordination rather than random violence. The raids always happened at isolated homesteads where there would be no witnesses to contradict the official narrative, and they always left just enough survivors to spread terror through settler communities, but not enough to provide accurate descriptions of the attackers. It was a systematic campaign of manufactured atrocity, and Jane knew that exposing it would require evidence more substantial than her own observations. The opportunity to gather real evidence came when a young cavalry lieutenant named Harrison arrived at her ranch one morning in late April, riding alone and looking exhausted from hard travel. Jane met him in her yard, with the rifle held loosely at her side, not threatening but not exactly welcoming either, and she waited for him to explain what had brought a soldier to her isolated property. Harrison dismounted stiffly and introduced himself with a formality that seemed out of place, asking if they could speak privately about a matter of considerable importance. Inside the cabin, Harrison pulled out a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag and spread them on her table. Documents that appeared to be official military reports about Indian raids in the region. He told Jane that he had been ordered to investigate the recent attacks and prepare recommendations for a military response. But the more he examined the evidence, the more inconsistencies he found that suggested something deeply wrong with the entire situation. The lieutenant explained that he had interviewed survivors from 3 different raids, and their descriptions of the attackers did not match known Comanche tactics or appearance. Harrison had examined physical evidence at attack sites and found things that made no sense if actual Indians had been responsible. Shell casings from military rifles rather than the trade guns most Comanche used. Boot prints that suggested white men in moccasins rather than native people who had worn such footwear their entire lives, and patterns of destruction that spoke of people trying to appear savage rather than warriors conducting actual raids. The lieutenant had begun to suspect a conspiracy, but he had no proof and no authority to investigate fellow soldiers or civilian militia who might be involved. Jane made a decision in that moment that she knew could cost her everything, and she told Harrison about what she had discovered at the Hutchinson place, describing the evidence she had seen and the conclusions she had drawn. She showed him her journal with its detailed notes from Comanche scouts about attack timings and locations, and she watched the lieutenant's face grow increasingly grim as he absorbed the implications. Harrison asked her directly if she had been in contact with hostile Indians, and Jane told him the truth, that she had an arrangement with Mamanti's band to provide medical care in exchange for supplies and protection. The lieutenant sat in silence for several minutes after Jane finished speaking, wrestling with the conflict between his duty as a soldier and his conscience as a man who believed in justice. Finally, he told Jane that he wanted to meet with Mamanti directly, that he believed a face-to-face conversation between a Comanche chief and a cavalry officer might be the only way to prevent the all-out war that certain factions were pushing toward. It was a radical proposal that could get Harrison court-martialed if his superiors discovered it, but Jane recognized it as potentially the best chance they had to expose the conspiracy. She told Harrison she would arrange the meeting, but that it would have to happen on neutral ground, and that he would need to come alone and unarmed. The lieutenant accepted these conditions without hesitation, and they set a date 3 days hence. Jane sent word to Mamanti through the Comanche scouts, explaining what had been proposed and asking if the chief would be willing to take the enormous risk. The answer came back within a day that Mamanti had agreed, but would be bringing hidden warriors ready to intervene if the situation turned dangerous. The meeting took place in a canyon 3 miles from Jane's ranch, where a spring-fed stream created a narrow strip of cottonwood trees that provided cover from observation. Jane arrived first with Dakota and 2 other warriors who melted into the shadows among the trees. Harrison arrived exactly on time, riding alone as promised, and visibly unarmed. Mamanti appeared from the darkness with a suddenness that made Harrison's horse shy, and the chief stood illuminated by moonlight with his arms crossed and his face showing no emotion. The 2 men studied each other across a distance of perhaps 10 feet, and Jane could feel the weight of centuries of conflict and mistrust hanging in the air between them. Mamanti spoke first in clear English, asking Harrison what a cavalry lieutenant wanted badly enough to risk meeting with a Comanche chief in the middle of the night. Harrison responded with equal directness, telling Mamanti that he believed both. Their peoples were being manipulated by white men who wanted war for their own profit and political advancement. He described the evidence he had gathered of false flag attacks, and he told Mamanti that he intended to file an official report exposing the conspiracy, but that such a report would carry more weight if it included testimony from Comanche sources about attacks that had been falsely attributed to them. The lieutenant offered Mamanti protection for any warriors who would be willing to testify before a military tribunal, and he promised that he would use his authority to delay any planned military campaigns against the Comanche until the truth could be established. Mamanti asked why a white soldier would risk his career and possibly his life to help Indians when his own people would condemn him as a traitor for doing so. Harrison's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. He said that he had joined the cavalry, believing he would be protecting innocent people from savagery, but that he had gradually come to understand that the real savagery often came from the people he was supposed to be serving, and that he could not continue to be complicit in injustice simply because questioning orders was difficult. The chief studied Harrison for a long moment, then nodded slowly and said that he would provide warriors to testify, but only if certain conditions were met. Mamanti demanded that any tribunal be held at a location where Comanche witnesses could retreat quickly if they sensed treachery, insisted that Jane be present as a guarantee of good faith from both sides, and required that Harrison provide written documentation of his investigation before the testimony occurred. These were reasonable demands given the enormous risks, and Harrison agreed to all of them without hesitation. Over the next 3 weeks, Harrison compiled his evidence, while Mamanti selected warriors willing to testify about their whereabouts during the times when attacks had supposedly been carried out by Comanche raiders. Jane's ranch became the center of activity, as both sides used it as neutral ground for planning meetings, and her barn was filled with maps and documents and testimony from survivors who contradicted the official narratives. It was dangerous and exhausting work, and Jane existed in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that discovery by the wrong people would mean death for everyone involved. The breakthrough came when Harrison identified a pattern in the shell casings found at attack sites. All of them came from a specific batch of military ammunition that had been issued to a ranging company commanded by none other than McAllister, the same man who had nearly discovered Paco and Hurit in Jane's barn months earlier. Harrison obtained records showing that McAllister had been requisitioning far more ammunition than his unit should have needed for normal patrol activities, and that the excess supplies corresponded exactly with the timing of the false flag raids. Harrison sent his report directly to the territorial governor, bypassing his immediate military superiors who might have been complicit in the conspiracy. The governor responded by ordering McAllister and his entire ranging company to report for questioning, and by suspending all military operations against Comanche bands until the investigation could be completed. It was a victory, but Jane knew it was also the moment when they would become targets for people desperate to prevent the truth from emerging. The attack came 2 nights after the governor's order became public knowledge, and it came with a violence that left no doubt about the attackers' intentions. Jane woke to the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke, and she grabbed the rifle and dove through her cabin window just as the front door exploded inward from a shotgun blast. She rolled behind the water trough and fired back at muzzle flashes in the darkness, unable to see her attackers clearly, but knowing that staying in one place meant death. Warriors appeared from the shadows, where they had been maintaining their usual watch over her property, and the night erupted into a firefight between Comanche defenders and the masked white men who had come to silence Jane before she could testify. The battle was brief but brutal, and when it ended, 3 of the attackers lay dead, while the others had fled into the darkness. Jane recognized one of the dead men as a member of McAllister's ranging company, confirmation that they had been targeted for elimination by the same people responsible for the false flag raids. Harrison arrived at dawn with a squad of cavalry loyal to him personally, and he surveyed the damage with a face that showed both anger and vindication. The evidence from the attack, the bodies of the rangers and the testimony of witnesses was enough to arrest McAllister and a dozen other conspirators who had been part of the campaign to manufacture war. The lieutenant told Jane that she would need to testify at the tribunal, and that her safety could not be guaranteed despite his best efforts. But Jane had already made her peace with the risks involved. The tribunal took place 6 weeks later at a hastily constructed meeting ground on the prairie, positioned so that Comanche witnesses could observe from nearby ridgelines and retreat quickly if necessary. Jane testified for 3 hours, describing everything she had witnessed, from the false evidence at the Hutchinson place to the staged attack on her own ranch. She endured hostile questioning from lawyers representing the accused men who tried to paint her as an Indian sympathizer who had fabricated testimony. But the physical evidence supported her statements, and when Mamanti himself appeared to provide testimony about his band's actual activities, the defense's case collapsed completely. McAllister and 7 others were convicted of murder and conspiracy, and they were sentenced to hang despite protests from settler factions who refused to believe that white men would betray their own people. The executions were carried out at the territorial capital, with Mamanti and Jane both present as witnesses, and Jane watched the men drop through the gallows trapdoor and felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness that so much death and suffering had been caused by greed and hatred dressed up as righteousness. In the months that followed, an uneasy peace settled over the territory as news of the conspiracy spread, and settlers began to question whether all the Indian violence they had feared had actually been real. Jane's ranch remained a neutral ground where Comanche and whites could meet without hostility, and she continued providing medical care while also serving as an informal liaison between Mamanti's band and the territorial government. On a morning in late summer, exactly 1 year after Paco and Hurit had first arrived at her property more dead than alive, Jane woke to find her yard filled with horses and riders, so many that she could not immediately count them all. She dressed quickly and stepped onto her porch expecting trouble, but what she found instead was Mamanti sitting on his horse at the head of what appeared to be his entire band. Every warrior and woman and child who belonged to his people gathered in complete silence. The chief dismounted and approached Jane with something wrapped in cloth. And when he unfolded it, she saw that it was a blanket, decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to create. Mamanti told her, through Takoda's translation, that the blanket was a gift from his entire band, recognition of her courage and her commitment to peace when it would have been easier and safer to remain neutral or side completely with her own people. He said that Jane had earned a place of honor not just in his band, but in the oral history of the Comanche people, and that stories about the white woman who gave her last horse to save two dying brothers and then risked everything to prevent a war would be told for generations. Jane accepted the blanket with hands that trembled, overwhelmed by the gesture and what it represented, and she looked out at the assembled Comanche and saw faces she had come to know as individuals rather than members of a threatening collective. She saw Paco and Hurit, both fully recovered and grown taller in the year since she had saved their lives. And she saw Kimi and the other women who had taught her so much about surviving in this harsh country. She saw Napona standing with the other warriors, his leg healed though he would always walk with a slight limp. As the sun climbed higher and bathed the prairie in golden light, every warrior in Mamanti's band dismounted and bowed their heads in a gesture of respect that left Jane speechless. She understood finally that the moment described in the opening of this story had arrived. The dawn when 200 Comanche warriors came to honor a white woman who had chosen mercy over safety and peace over vengeance, and in doing so had proved that bridges between worlds were possible, even when everything suggested they should not be. Jane stood on her porch wearing the bear claw necklace and the turquoise pendant, wrapped in the ceremonial blanket and surrounded by people who had once been strangers and enemies, but had become something far more important. They had become the family she had lost when Thomas died. The ranch that had nearly killed her with loneliness and hardship had become the center of something that mattered. A place where different peoples could meet as equals, and where the future might hold possibilities beyond endless conflict. As the Comanche began to depart, riding back toward their camp, Mamanti lingered for a final word with Jane. He told her that the peace they had built was fragile and would require constant work to maintain, but that it was worth the effort because the alternative was destruction for both their peoples. He said that Jane had shown everyone involved that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest act was refusing to hate when hatred was expected. Jane watched them go until the last rider disappeared over the horizon, and then she went back into her cabin to begin the work of another day, moving through routines that had become comfortable and familiar. She had given her last mare to two dying Comanche brothers, and at dawn 200 warriors had bowed before her. And between those two moments she had discovered that the life she thought she was building on this frontier was nothing compared to the life that had built itself around her when she chose to help rather than turn away. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.